Her hand went to the folder she was holding, and it slipped. Just slipped right out of her grip, papers scattering across the foot of my bed like she had forgotten how to hold things. My name is Nora Scott. And the woman standing in my bedroom at 3:20 in the morning, watching her legal documents slide to the floor, was my older sister, Diane Bellamy. The man beside her, rigid and uncomfortable in a way that told me he had not been warned this would be a sleeping household, was a notary she had apparently hired and dragged to my home in the middle of the night. Behind them, my bedroom door was still swinging open from where she had pushed it. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I sat up slowly, pushed the hair out of my face, and looked at her the way you look at someone who has just confirmed everything you already suspected. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got here. To understand that night, you need to understand Diane. And to understand Diane, you need to understand what our family looked like from the outside versus what it felt like on the inside. On the outside, we were a close-knit family. Two sisters, loving parents, Sunday dinners, the whole picture. On the inside, there was a very clear architecture. Diane was the older one, the responsible one, the one our mother always described as having her head on straight. I was the younger one, the one who had my daughter at 26 without being married, the one who had taken what our parents called a risky path professionally, the one who, according to Diane, had never quite figured out how to be a proper adult. My daughter's name is Lily. She turned 8 last spring. Her biological father and I separated before she was 2, and I have had full legal custody since she was 3. That part matters. I want to be clear about it early because the whole story hinges on it. Lily is my biological daughter. I am her legal guardian, established by a custody order finalized in family court. Diane is her aunt. Diane's husband, Russell Bellamy, is her uncle by marriage. They have no biological connection to Lily and no legal standing over her life whatsoever. I want you to hold that fact in your mind, because Diane had apparently spent several months convincing herself otherwise. Our parents, my mother Carol and my late father Edward, who passed from a cardiac event 4 years ago, were the kind of people who genuinely believed that keeping the peace was the highest virtue. My father had been warm, a little passive, the kind of man who smoothed things over rather than naming them. My mother was the same, only she had made it into an art form. After my father died, she leaned into that instinct even harder. She didn't want conflict. She wanted the appearance of a family that loved each other, which is not always the same thing. Diane had always been the one who managed my mother's anxieties, and I think that role, over the years, had calcified into something else. It had become control. Diane decided what was discussed at family dinners. Diane organized the holidays. Diane was the one who called my mother every morning, which meant Diane was the one who shaped my mother's perception of everything happening in our family, including me. The first time I understood how deliberate this was, Lily was about 4 years old. I had just signed a consulting contract with a regional healthcare network, my first significant engagement, a real step forward professionally. I had not told anyone in the family yet because I wanted to make sure it went through before I said anything. I showed up to Sunday dinner at my mother's house, and Diane spent most of the meal suggesting that I look into administrative positions at the school district. She had even brought a printed job listing. She slid it across the table with a look of genuine concern on her face and said her friend Karen worked in HR there and could put in a word for me. I thanked her. I folded the listing and put it in my pocket. I did not tell her that I had signed a contract 2 days earlier that was going to pay me more in 6 months than a school district administrative position would pay in 3 years. I just smiled and asked her to pass the bread. That night, I emailed my contact at the healthcare network to confirm the project's start date. What Diane understood about me and what was actually true had become two completely separate things. And I had decided, not out of arrogance but out of clarity, that I was not going to spend my energy correcting her. I was going to spend it building. What I didn't know then was that she had already started making quiet comments to my mother about my lifestyle, about the fact that I was raising Lily essentially alone, about whether my work schedule was appropriate for a single parent. I found this out much later from my mother, in a conversation that my mother clearly hadn't meant to be as revealing as it was. The second incident happened about a year and a half later. Lily was 5 and had just been enrolled in a specialized learning program through her school, a program for kids with above-average verbal ability who needed more structured challenge in the classroom. I was proud of her. I mentioned it at a family gathering, and Diane's response was to turn to my mother and say that she hoped I wasn't pushing Lily too hard, that some children just needed to be children, that she had read an article about overscheduled kids and the anxiety it caused. Lily was in an enrichment program. She was 5. She loved it. She came home talking about the books they were reading and the puzzles they were working through with her cohort teacher, a wonderful woman named Ms. Acaffer who Lily adored. I didn't defend myself. I watched Diane's face while she spoke, the way her voice carried just enough performance in it that I knew she was talking to my mother more than to me. She needed my mother to share her worry. And my mother, true to form, nodded and said she just wanted everyone to be happy and maybe we should all get some more tea. That was the moment I understood what Diane was actually doing. It wasn't concern, it was positioning. Every gentle suggestion, every worried article, every well meaning comment was a brick in a wall she was building between me and my mother's confidence in me. I had filed away enough of those moments by then to see the pattern clearly. Not out of bitterness, out of precision. What I didn't know was that she had already started talking to someone about something much more concrete. The third incident was the one that finally made me move. This was about 11 months before the night I opened my eyes to find her standing at the foot of my bed. Lily had been seeing a pediatric occupational therapist, a specialist named Dr. Annan Maida, who had been helping her with some fine motor coordination that her pediatrician wanted monitored. Nothing alarming. Lily thought the sessions were like a game. She called them her puzzle appointments. It was Dr. Maida who first flagged that Lily had a medical trust account through my father's estate, something my father had set up before he died, and that I should make sure all her treatment costs were being routed correctly through the trustee structure. My father had established a modest medical trust for Lily before he passed. The trustee was a family law attorney named Gerald Osai, who my father had worked with for years and trusted completely. The trust existed to cover Lily's medical and educational needs up to the age of 25. Gerald managed it. I had nothing to sign, nothing to authorize. He handled disbursements directly with providers. I just made sure Dr. Maida's billing coordinator had Gerald's contact information. Diane knew the trust existed. What she apparently didn't know was how it was structured or who controlled it. Because at that same gathering, Lily's birthday party that November, the one Diane had offered to host, Diane pulled me aside and told me, with what she clearly believed was a generous expression on her face, that she had been thinking a lot about Lily's future. That she and Russell were in a very stable position. That if I ever felt overwhelmed, she wanted me to know she was there. I thanked her. I told her I appreciated it. She looked at me for a moment with something behind her eyes that I couldn't quite name at the time. I named it later. It was calculation. She had come to that conversation with something specific in mind, and when I didn't take the opening she was offering, something shifted in her expression, just slightly. Just enough. I went home that night, put Lily to bed, and called my attorney the next morning. Not Gerald, a different attorney. A family law specialist named Adiz Nwasu, who a colleague of mine had worked with during her own custody matter and recommended without hesitation. I had first consulted with Adiz on March 3rd, 2023, about 18 months after the custody order was finalized, just to make sure everything was in order. We had kept in loose contact since then. I called her the morning after Lily's birthday party and said I needed a full review of my custody documentation and I needed to understand exactly what legal options, if any, existed for a third party to challenge my guardianship. Adiz listened. She asked a few questions. Then she said, "Let's schedule something this week." We met on March 8th. She went through everything with me, the original custody order, the trust structure, Lily's school records, medical documentation. At the end of the meeting, she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "You're more protected than you realize, but protected doesn't mean untouchable. If someone files something, the process starts regardless. So let's make sure that if anything ever lands on a judge's desk, what they see on your side is airtight." We spent the next several weeks making it airtight. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters. I didn't know at that point that Diane was planning anything specific. I was operating on instinct and pattern recognition, the accumulation of those incidents, that look in her eyes at the birthday party, a general sense that the air in our family had shifted in a direction I didn't fully understand yet. I was building a legal record the same way I had always approached things I couldn't entirely see yet, methodically, quietly, without broadcasting what I was doing. Gerald Osa and I also had a conversation during that period. I asked him to do a full audit of the medical trust, every disbursement, every authorization, every record going back to when my father established it. Gerald was thorough by nature and took the request seriously. He completed the audit in about 3 weeks and sent me a full summary. Everything was in order, every dollar accounted for. He also, at my request, formally documented that I was the sole named beneficiary parent on the trust, and that no disbursements could be authorized without his approval as trustee. He sent that documentation to Adiz as well. I remember sitting in Adie's office on a Thursday afternoon in April, looking at the full picture of what we had assembled, and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Not fear, not anger, something more like stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when you have done everything you can do and you are simply waiting to see what arrives. Adie's told me to keep my phone nearby. She said it in a way that made me think she expected something to arrive sooner than I did. She was right. There were two moments during those months that came close to surfacing what I was doing, and both of them happened at family dinners. The first at my mother's house in May, the second at Diane and Russell's home in July. The May dinner was a Sunday afternoon, the kind that started early and ran long. My mother had made her usual spread, and everyone was at the table: my mother, Diane, Russell, and their teenage son Cooper, who was 16 at the time and mostly interested in his phone. Lily was at the table too, working quietly on a small drawing she had brought with her. Diane had been talking about a property she and Russell were considering, a vacation house upstate, something they had been looking at for a while. She mentioned what they were hoping to pay, and then, in the way she had developed over years of practice, she turned the conversation toward me. She asked, with her head tilted just slightly, how things were going with my work, whether I was keeping busy. She said it the way you say something to someone you believe is barely keeping up. I told her things were going well. She nodded in the way that suggested she wanted more: a number, a detail, something she could evaluate. When I didn't offer one, she said she had heard that the consulting market was getting competitive, that a lot of people were finding it harder to maintain steady income without a more traditional structure. She said her friend's husband had gone back to a salaried position after a few years on his own and was much happier for it. That makes sense for some people, I said. Lily looked up from her drawing. Mom works a lot, she announced to no one in particular. She's always on the phone with people. Diane smiled at her. That's because your mom works very hard, sweetheart. Lily went back to her drawing. She closed a big thing last week. She said it was good news. There was a pause. Diane's eyes came back to me. I kept my expression entirely neutral. What Lily had described, without knowing what it meant, was a contract renewal I had finalized the previous Tuesday, a significant one. Adiz and I had spoken that same afternoon to discuss how the renewal affected a financial disclosure that was part of the documentation we were building. Good news is always welcome, I said, and reached over to refill my water glass. Diane watched me for a moment. I could see her trying to decide whether to ask more directly. She decided against it. But something shifted in her posture, just slightly, just enough. She had registered that there was something she didn't know, and she didn't like it. That was the moment I understood how close to the edge I was operating. Not because I had said too much, I hadn't said anything. But because Lily, being 8 years old and honest in the way that 8-year-olds are, had said just enough to make Diane aware that there was a surface she hadn't seen under yet. And Diane was not the kind of person who let unturned surfaces lie. I had less time than I thought. The July dinner at Diane and Russell's house was the closer call. Lily was at a summer day camp that week, staying with a camp friend for a sleepover, so it was just the adults. Russell had grilled, which he was genuinely good at, and the evening had a surface warmth to it that made the moment that followed feel even more deliberate in retrospect. After dinner, while my mother was in the kitchen and Cooper had retreated upstairs, Russell poured himself another drink and said, almost casually, that he had run into Gerald Osa at a Chamber of Commerce event a few weeks earlier. I kept my face completely still. Russell said Gerald seemed like a good man, very professional. He mentioned that he and Diane had been curious about the structure of the trust my father had set up for Lily, not in a nosy way, he said, just because family finances could get complicated and they wanted to make sure everyone understood how things were arranged. I looked at him. Then I looked at Diane, who was studying the stem of her wine glass. The trust is managed by Gerald, I said. Everything goes through him, it's very straightforward. Russell nodded. Of course. We just weren't sure, whether there was a secondary trustee named anywhere. In case something happened to you, Diane worries. There are contingency provisions in the documents, I said. Gerald handles all of that. And you're comfortable with that structure? Russell asked. His voice was still casual, just a little too casual. Completely, I said. Diane set her glass down. We just want to make sure Lily is protected, that's all. She is, I said. There was a silence that lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then my mother came back from the kitchen with a plate of fruit and said, wasn't it a beautiful evening? And the conversation moved on the way conversations do when everyone at the table has decided, for different reasons, not to push further. I drove home at 9:45 that night with the air conditioning on full and the radio off. I called Adiz the next morning and told her what Russell had said about running into Gerald. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm going to file the counterpetition documentation this week. Not because something has happened yet, because I want it timestamped before anything does. She filed it on July 22nd. I want you to hold that date, because what happened next happened on the night of August 9th, and the timestamp on that filing is the reason the story ends the way it does. Everything I had built was about to be tested. And the person who thought she was arriving to catch me off guard had no idea what she was walking into. The night of August 9th started the way those nights always do, quietly. Lily was asleep. The house was dark. I had been in bed since 10:30, which for me was early, but I had a call scheduled for 7 the following morning with a client in a different time zone, and I had made a deliberate choice to actually sleep for once. I don't know what time I fell asleep. I know it was before 11 because I remember checking my phone and seeing the evening news still running on the television in the living room, and I had turned it off and gone to bed. I know the next thing I saw was my bedroom ceiling lit by the hallway light, which meant the door was open, which meant someone had opened it. Diane was standing at the foot of my bed in a blazer. At 3:20 in the morning. The man beside her was in his 50s, round-faced, holding a leather portfolio in front of him with both hands. He had a notary stamp on a lanyard around his neck. He looked like a man who had been paid a significant premium to be somewhere he clearly did not want to be. I looked at them. I looked at the folder Diane was holding. She had a whole presentation ready that was clear. She had practiced this. The blazer at 3 in the morning told me that. You don't put on a blazer in the middle of the night by accident. I sat up. I did not speak. Diane's voice came out with the practiced steadiness of someone who had been rehearsing for weeks. Nora. I need you to sign some documents. It's important. For Lily? I still didn't say anything. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. It was a reflex, the same reflex I had developed over the past several months of building something I intended to use. I unlocked it. I opened the email thread with a D's. I forwarded her the most recent court filing confirmation, a document that had been sitting in my sent folder since July 22nd, to the address I had saved under the contact name simply as Attorney Urgent. Then I looked at Diane. Read the timestamp on the counterpetition already in the system. She stopped, completely stopped. The folder she was holding slipped out of her grip, papers scattering across the foot of my bed, across the floor, against the notary's shoes. She stared at me. Her mouth was open, and nothing was coming out of it. The notary took a small step back, as if he had suddenly realized he was standing in the middle of something that was much larger than the job he had been hired for. But let me tell you what had happened in the weeks before that moment, because the middle of the night was not where the story began. It began at a birthday dinner, and it began with a number. If you're still with me, stay, because what happened next is the reason I am telling you this story. It was a Saturday in early August. My mother's 71st birthday. She had wanted a family dinner, not a party, just dinner at Diane and Russell's house, the way she liked it. Nothing elaborate. My mother had always been modest about birthdays. She said big celebrations made her feel like people were practicing for her funeral. Diane had organized everything, the way she always organized everything. The table was set by the time I arrived at 6 with Lily in the backseat, who had made my mother a card at school that week, with a drawing of a flower on the front that she was very proud of. Lily ran in ahead of me with the card held in both hands. My mother met her at the door and made exactly the right kind of fuss over the flower. Russell was at the grill on the back patio, which was his domain and where he was happiest. Cooper, who was now 17, was in the corner of the living room with the particular posture of a teenager who had been told he had to be present but not told he had to be enthusiastic. My mother's friend from church, a woman named Gladys Oduya who had known our family for 20 years, was seated at the kitchen island with a glass of wine, talking to nobody in particular but not seeming to mind. It felt, for about 45 minutes, like a normal evening. I had brought a bottle of wine my mother liked and a small potted lavender plant because she had mentioned twice in the past month that she wanted something to put on the kitchen windowsill. I set both on the counter. Diane looked at the lavender plant with a brief, evaluating expression that she replaced quickly with a smile. "That's sweet," she said. "She mentioned it a few weeks ago." I poured a glass of water from the pitcher on the counter. "You know Mom can't keep plants alive. The lavender is hard to kill." Diane's expression did a small, subtle thing, a flicker of something that wasn't quite irritation but was related to it. She had wanted to manage the gifts. She had wanted to be the one who had thought of everything. She turned back to the stove. Dinner came together around 7. The table sat 7, my mother, Diane, Russell, Cooper, Gladys, Lily, and me. Lily had been placed between my mother and Gladys, which Lily was deeply pleased about because Gladys always had mints in her purse, and my mother always let Lily have an extra roll. The first part of dinner was easy. Russell's cooking was genuinely good, and the food created enough common ground that the conversation stayed surface level. My mother talked about her garden. Gladys talked about a trip she was planning to visit her daughter in Atlanta. Cooper contributed exactly 2 sentences. It was around the third round of water refills that Diane made her first move. She had been building to it the way she always built. The conversation had drifted to real estate. Russell had mentioned the vacation property upstate that was still in consideration. And from there, without it seeming like a pivot to anyone who didn't know her well, she landed on the topic of financial planning. Specifically, she said, the importance of having the right people in place to make decisions if something ever happened. My mother nodded. She said Edward had always been so careful about that. She said she still thought about the trust he had set up for Lily. She said it was such a loving thing to do. Diane set her fork down, not carelessly, deliberately. That's actually something I've been wanting to bring up, Mom. I've been talking to someone about it, a family law consultant, just to get some perspective. I looked at her. She was looking at my mother. There are situations, Diane continued, her voice even and thoughtful, where a trust structure that made sense when it was set up doesn't really reflect where the family is now, where things might be better managed with a different arrangement. My mother looked uncertain. What do you mean different? Just more active oversight. Someone who's more present in Lily's day-to-day life. The table was quiet. Gladys was looking at her plate. Russell was looking at his wife. Cooper had stopped eating. Lily was trying to get the last of the butter onto her roll and was not paying attention to the adults. I put my glass down. Are you suggesting you'd be better positioned to manage Lily's trust than Gerald? Diane turned to look at me for the first time since she had started speaking. I'm suggesting that Lily deserves to have people around her who are stable, who are consistently present, whose situation isn't in flux. My situation isn't in flux. Your work schedule, Nora. Her voice stayed gentle, and that gentleness was the most dangerous thing about it. You travel, you're on calls at all hours. I just worry about consistency for her. Lily, without looking up from her roll, Mom's always home when I get home from school. Diane smiled at her. I know, sweetheart. And she comes to all my puzzle appointments. Lily finally got the butter distributed to her satisfaction and took a large bite. Russell cleared his throat. We just want to make sure everyone is set up for success, that's all. I looked at him. Then I looked at Diane. Then I looked at my mother, who was watching me with the careful expression of a woman who wanted badly to believe that everything was fine. Gerald has managed the trust exactly as my father set it up, I said. Every disbursement has been documented. Every decision has been made correctly. If there's a specific concern, I'd be happy to have Adiz and Gerald both present for a conversation, but I don't think this is the right time or place. Diane's jaw tightened just slightly. This isn't an attack, Nora. I didn't say it was. I picked up my fork. But I want to be clear, the trust structure is not changing, and I would prefer we not have this conversation in front of Lily. Lily was now examining the lavender plant my mother had moved to the center of the table as a centerpiece. She touched one of the stems with one finger. It smells good, she announced. My mother reached over and patted her hand. It does, doesn't it? The rest of the dinner passed in a kind of strained surface warmth. Gladys mentioned her Atlanta trip again. Russell refilled everyone's water. Cooper asked to be excused at 8:15 and nobody stopped him. But I watched Diane for the rest of the evening. I watched the way she moved through the kitchen when we were clearing the dishes. The way she had a quiet exchange with Russell near the sink that stopped the moment I came through the doorway. The way she kept looking at my mother, checking, calibrating. She was not done, that was clear. She had tried one approach at the table and it hadn't landed the way she needed it to. She was adjusting. I buckled Lily into the backseat at 9:10. Lily was half asleep before I had pulled out of the driveway, her cheek against the window, the paper card she had made for my mother still on her lap because my mother had given it back to her to keep. I had 47 minutes of drive time. I used 20 of them to think. I used the remaining 27 to call Adiz. She answered on the second ring. I told her about the dinner, about the family law consultant Diane had mentioned, about the phrase, more active oversight. About the way Russell had asked about a secondary trustee. Adiz was quiet for a moment. Then her voice came through very steady. She's not just posturing anymore. She's consulting with someone. That changes the timeline. What do I need to do? I need you to call Gerald first thing tomorrow morning. He needs to send you a written confirmation of the current trust status. Every account, every balance, everything. And he needs to document that no changes have been made and no inquiries have come through his office. And if inquiries have come through, another pause. Then we move faster. Can you get Lily somewhere safe for a few days if things escalate? I thought of my friend Jonelle, who lived 20 minutes away and who had offered to take Lily any time I needed a break. Lily called her house her second home. Yes, call Gerald, then call me back. I called Gerald at 8:15 the following morning. He was already in the office. I asked him to pull the full trust record and confirm the current status of every account under Lily's trust. There was a pause on his end that lasted long enough for me to feel it. Nora, his voice was careful. I received a request 2 days ago from someone identifying themselves as a family representative. They were asking for a summary of the trust structure and asset breakdown. The inside of my chest went very quiet. Did you provide it? Absolutely not. I flagged it immediately and did not respond, but I should have called you that day. I apologize for that. Who made the request? It came through email from an address I didn't recognize, but the name on the inquiry was a law firm, Bellamy and Associates. He paused again. I looked them up. It's a one-person operation, licensed in the state. The attorney of record's last name is the same as your brother-in-law's. I pulled up Adi's contact and called her on speaker before Gerald had finished his sentence. By noon that day, Adiz had filed an emergency notice of representation with the family court, formally documenting that I was represented by counsel and that any third-party inquiries regarding my daughter's guardianship or trust were to be directed to her office only. She also reached out to Gerald to formalize the protective documentation on the trust, a step that took until late afternoon but was completed before 5. Gerald also confirmed, in a written statement that went directly to Adiz, that $3,200 had been transferred out of a holding subaccount within Lily's trust on August 7th, 2 days before my mother's birthday dinner. The transfer had not come through Gerald. It had not been authorized by him. It had gone to a newly opened account under the name of a Bellamy Family LLC that had been registered 61 days earlier. That was the number. $3,200. Lily's money, taken without authorization. I sat in my car in the parking structure outside Adiz's building, and I did not cry. I did not shake. I felt something move through me that was colder and more precise than anger. It was clarity. The kind that arrives when you realize you have been right about something you wished you had been wrong about. Adiz had already spoken with a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit by the time I walked back into her office at 4:30. She explained what had happened in plain language. An unauthorized transfer from a minor child's trust account, facilitated through a fraudulently established LLC, was not a family dispute, it was fraud. It was potentially a felony, depending on how the transfer had been executed and whether forged authorization had been used to initiate it. The detective, a woman named Officer Renata Suarez, asked me a series of questions. I answered them. Adiz provided the documentation. Officer Suarez said she would begin the process of obtaining the transfer records from the financial institution and would be in contact with Gerald directly. I drove home. I made Lily dinner. She told me about a project she was working on at school, something involving butterflies, I think, or maybe moths. I listened. I made appropriate noises of interest. I watched her eat her pasta and I thought, she is safe. She is here. And what is coming is already in motion. I called Jonelle after Lily was asleep and asked if she could take Lily for a couple of days starting the following weekend. Jonelle said, of course. She didn't ask questions. That is the kind of friend Jonelle is. I went to sleep on August 9th thinking I had a few more days before anything arrived at my front door. I did not have a few more days. I had a few more hours. The rest you already know. Diane standing at the foot of my bed, the notary with his leather portfolio, the papers on the floor. What you don't know yet is what I did next, and what happened after. I got out of bed. I did not hurry. I put on the robe that was hanging on the back of the bathroom door. I walked to the kitchen and filled a glass of water. Then I came back to the doorway of my own bedroom and looked at my sister and the man she had brought into my house. The notary had gathered the papers from the floor. He was holding them awkwardly, looking somewhere above and to the left of my head, in the direction of a spot on the wall that was suddenly very interesting to him. Diane had found her composure. She had it back, mostly. Nora, I know this is a shock, but this is the right thing for Lily. The documents are standard. A temporary guardianship transfer just until we can get the living situation stabilized. Diane? My voice was not loud. It was not anything in particular. What time did you access the trust subaccount on August 7th? She stopped. Because the transfer timestamp is on the bank record, and the bank record is already in the hands of a financial crimes detective. The notary's head turned. He looked at me for the first time. Then he looked at Diane. She took one breath. I don't know what you're talking about. The Bellamy Family LLC was registered 61 days ago. The attorney of record is someone who shares your husband's last name and operates out of a one-person firm that was opened 63 days ago. The inquiry to Gerald's office came 2 days before my mother's birthday dinner. The transfer came 2 days after you registered the LLC. I looked at her steadily. You want to tell me you don't know what I'm talking about? Her hand went up to her collarbone. She pressed her fingers against it, a gesture I had never seen from her before. Like she was checking to make sure it was still there. Those documents, I gestured toward the folder the notary was holding, will not be signed tonight or any other night, and I think you should know that Adiz filed the counterpetition on July 22nd, 19 days ago. Whatever you plan to walk into family court with tomorrow morning is already answered. The notary cleared his throat. He spoke for the first and only time that night. Ma'am, I need to step outside for a moment. He stepped around Diane, past me, down the hallway, and out the front door, which I had not locked because it had not occurred to me that I would need to that evening. I heard the front door close very gently behind him. Diane and I stood in my bedroom doorway, just the two of us. Her mouth opened. I was trying to protect her. No, I kept my voice level. You were trying to get control of a trust you thought was under-supervised. When you figured out it wasn't going to be as easy as you thought, you took $3,200 and hoped no one would notice. That money was for, it's Lily's money. Gerald is her trustee. You are not authorized to access, transfer, or manage a single dollar of it. That is not an opinion. That is the legal structure my father built. And what you did on August 7th is a felony. The word landed between us. Diane's shoulders did something I had not expected. They dropped. Not in defeat exactly, in something more like deflation. The structure she had been holding herself in, the blazer at 3 in the morning, all of it, it went out of her the way air goes out of something that has been punctured. You called the police, she said. It was not a question. A financial crimes detective has the transfer records. Yes. She put her hand over her mouth. She stood like that for a moment. Then, she stopped. She tried again. I thought if I had guardianship, I could manage everything better. I thought you were overwhelmed. I genuinely thought, you thought my father left something behind and you wanted access to it. My voice did not rise. It did not have to. You dressed it up in concern for Lily because that's the version of yourself you needed to believe. But Diane, you hired a notary and came to my house at 3 in the morning to make me sign documents while I was asleep. That is not concern. That is something else entirely. She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes, for the first time in my memory, were completely undefended. There was no calculation in them, no management. Just a woman standing in a hallway at 3:30 in the morning, understanding what she had done and what it was going to cost her. What happens now? She asked. Now you leave my house, and then whatever happens next will happen through the appropriate channels. She left. I walked her to the door. I watched her get into her car, a black Audi that Russell had bought 2 years ago, and I stood in the doorway until the tail lights disappeared. Then I locked the door. I went to check on Lily. She was asleep on her back with her arms out to her sides, the way she always slept, completely undisturbed. I stood in the doorway of her room for about 30 seconds. Then I went to bed. I did not sleep for a long time, but I was calm. I was as calm as I had been in months. The morning came the way mornings do, with Lily's alarm going off down the hall and her voice immediately asking if there were waffles. There were not waffles. There were eggs and toast, and the particular negotiation that happens when an 8-year-old has been promised waffles in her mind without anyone actually promising waffles. I made eggs. She ate them. I dropped her at Jonelle's house after school that day, explained to Jonelle only that I was managing a family situation, and drove from there directly to Adiz's office. What happened over the following 6 weeks was not dramatic in the way that 3 in the morning was dramatic. It was procedural and thorough, and final in the way that only institutional processes can be final. Officer Suarez obtained the transfer records from the financial institution. The records confirmed that the transfer had been initiated using a document that purported to be a trustee authorization signed by Gerald. The signature on that document was not Gerald's. Adiz provided Gerald's actual signature on file for comparison. A forensic document examiner confirmed within 3 weeks that the authorization letter was a forgery. Diane was charged with fraud and forgery, both felonies. Russell, who had registered the LLC and whose family attorney had made the inquiry to Gerald's office, was charged as a co-conspirator. The Bellamy family LLC was dissolved by court order. The $3,200 was returned to the trust in full within 10 days of the charges being filed, as part of a legal proceeding that Gerald described to me as unusually swift. Adiz said it was swift because the documentation was overwhelming, and because neither Diane nor Russell had retained an attorney who was prepared for how prepared we were. My mother called me the day after the charges became a matter of public court record. She had been told by Diane. She called me. She was crying. She kept saying she didn't know. I believe her. My mother is not a strategist. She's a woman who wanted her family to be fine and had allowed herself to believe Diane's version of events because Diane had been telling her a version of events for years. Believing the alternative would have required her to rebuild her entire understanding of her older daughter. That is not a small thing to ask of anyone. We talked for a long time. I told her everything, starting from March 8th, 2023, and the first consultation with Adiz. I told her about the July dinner and what Russell had said about running into Gerald. I told her about the birthday party and the transfer and the notary at 3:20 in the morning. My mother listened. She did not interrupt. At the end, she said, "I owe you an apology for not seeing it." I told her she owed me nothing. That is the truth. I don't want an apology from my mother for not catching something Diane had spent years making very difficult to see. Gladys Oduya, who had been at the birthday dinner, reached out a few weeks later. She said she had seen Diane's expression when I had pushed back at the table about the trust, and she had known in that moment that something was wrong. She said she wished she had said something. I told her the same thing I told my mother. There was nothing she could have done. The machinery had already been set in motion before that dinner. Diane and Russell's marriage did not survive the legal process. Russell filed for separation 4 months after the charges were filed. He maintained, through his attorney, that he had not known about the forgery, only about the LLC and the inquiry to Gerald. Whether that is entirely true, I cannot say. What I know is that a judge will eventually have a view about it. Diane is not in prison. The charges resulted in a plea agreement that involved restitution, a significant fine, probation, and community service. Adiz and I reviewed the terms. Given Diane's lack of a prior record and the full financial restitution, it was the realistic outcome. What it also meant was a permanent mark on her record and the end of the professional relationships she had built over a career in financial consulting. Her firm terminated her position within a week of the charges being filed. She now works part-time at a property management company and lives in an apartment about 40 minutes from my mother. Lily knows that there was a problem with some grown-ups in the family and that it got fixed. She knows that her puzzle appointments with Dr. Maida are still happening, that her trust is still safe and being managed by Gerald, and that she is going to camp again next summer. She asked me last month if Aunt Diane was coming to her school play. I told her no. She thought about this for a second and then said, "Okay, can Grandma come?" Grandma came. My mother sat in the third row and cried appropriately at all the right moments, which is the correct response to an elementary school play. Afterward, we all went to get ice cream, and Lily ordered 2 scoops of something bright green and ate the entire thing. My work is in a strong place. The contract I had renewed the previous summer led to 2 referral engagements, and by January, I had brought on a part-time associate to help manage the load. The consulting business I had been building quietly while my sister told my mother I seemed overwhelmed is, by any measurement, the thing it was always going to be. I don't hate Diane. What I feel toward her now is something more neutral than that, something closer to distance. I think she told herself a story about Lily, and about me, and about what our family needed, and somewhere in the telling of that story, she crossed a line she couldn't come back from. I think she made a decision that she convinced herself was protection and was actually control. I think she had been afraid of me for longer than she would ever admit, and that fear turned into something that hurt my daughter's financial security and brought police involvement into our family and landed her in a courtroom. I think those were her choices. I think she lives with them now. What I know for certain is that Lily fell asleep in the backseat on the drive home from the ice cream place, her face a little sticky and completely at ease, and I sat at a red light and looked at her in the rearview mirror and thought, this is the part I was protecting. All of it was for this. So, did I do the right thing calling the detective before I even confronted Diane, or should I have given her a chance to make it right first? Tell me in the comments.